everyone. Welcome to the I Remember When special program from the Fitchburg Historical Society and Fitchburg Access TV. I'm Susan Navarre. I'm the Executive Director at the Fitchburg Historical Society, and we have two guests here today to talk about mid-century modernism in Fitchburg, specifically looking at the architecture of Carl Koch, who did the Fitchburg Public Library and the corporate headquarters of the Fitchburg Paper Company. So my two guests are Russ Karlstad and Keith Cheneau. Keith Cheneau from Fitchburg State University and Russ from the city of Fitchburg. And can you tell us a little bit about your architectural background?
Sure. This is Keith. I studied architecture many years ago and practiced for several years and became an instructor at Fitchburg State for the kind of second part of my career, if you will. So. And I've been teaching in the engineering technology department where we have kind of applying engineering principles to electronics, to manufacturing, construction, and in architecture. So I've had a chance to kind of go back and restudy a little bit what maybe I had shortchanged on a little bit, but that's my background.
And Russ, you and I got started talking about Fitchburg's architecture, and we both had lots of ideas and opinions about the modern architecture here in Fitchburg, and I asked you if you'd come on this show because of your background.
Yeah, I was sort of forced into the show today by Susan, which is fine. But I studied architecture back in the 80s and 90s, and I practiced in architecture for a number of years, both here on the East Coast and the Southwest, and architecture and engineering. And I've slowly transitioned into a facilities job or position, which I feel is like a true architecture practice for myself, where you are totally immersed into the building daily. So currently I'm the director of facilities for the city of Fitchburg, the new department, first hire here. So I'm getting immersed into the city as deeply as I can, as quickly as I can.
Yeah. And so what we are talking about today, when I said mid-century modernism, the century we're talking about is the 20th century. So we're looking at buildings that were created in the first half of the 20th century, starting, we're going to talk a tiny bit about the beginning of modernism and in the 19-teens and 20s, maybe even a little earlier. Take a quick look at that. But mostly we'll be talking about things from around 1950, from the Second World War on. And many of our viewers who are baby boomers will recognize a lot of this architecture as being the architecture of their lifetimes. So we'll start first with a little film that we did about some of that context and the architecture in Fitchburg. 20th century Fitchburg was an industrial city. Through most of its history, it was shaped by practical considerations, but not aesthetics. The factories lined the Nashua River and spread up onto Main Street. Its explosive growth around the Civil War and afterwards left Fitchburg with a treasure box of Victorian architecture, with buildings that were solidly built and featured decoration inside and out. The original Rodney Wallace Library and Art Gallery was on Main Street. Here we see a typical home library interior from the same time. The city grew explosively. By around 1900, 3/4 of the city's population was either foreign-born or the children of foreign-born workers. The native-born Yankees were increasingly well off and were able to acquire luxuries and take up many hobbies. After World War II, Main Street was lively with returned soldiers and their families. Fitchburg's urban center had grown up with commercial, industrial, and public buildings, all crammed close together. As the city got wealthier, its practical industrial structures were increasingly replaced with deliberately designed and monumental, classically influenced styles. But Fitchburg was expanding so quickly that there was money to try out every innovation. There were streamlined streets, prefabricated diners manufactured in Worcester and influenced by railcar manufacturing, which was also an early Fitchburg history. And there were new approaches to factory design and production. The example of the Simons windowless factory in 1940 was published all across Europe in the architectural press. Carl Koch received his master's from the Harvard School of Design in 1937. The next year, he traveled to Sweden on a fellowship and became interested in the Swedish approach to fabrication. When he came back, he built a home for himself in Belmont, Massachusetts, along with 5 other houses that were hailed by Progressive Architecture magazine as one of the best known and significant groups of contemporary houses in the world. The Snake Hill location was chosen because of its wonderful views of Boston, its convenience to stores and trains, and because it was cheap, because it was thought it couldn't be possible to build on those rocky ledges. One of the innovations that the builders installed in the development was a boiler house that heated underground pipes and kept the street clear of ice and snow. This is famously true of Stockholm, Sweden, as well. During World War II, he served in the Navy and ended up serving with the Monuments Men, who protected and repatriated the masterpieces of art that had been stolen by the Nazis. After coming home, he developed some prefabricated home designs that could be assembled. The first versions failed because of skeptical politicians and local building codes. But by 1953, he invented the tech-built system, which was a success. They were shipped all over the United States, and his firm, Carl Koch and Associates in Cambridge, thrived from 1939 to 1978. He ended up being known as the grandfather of prefab. Besides his buildings in Fitchburg, Koch also built Lewis Wharf condominiums in Boston and the Cambridge School in Cambridge. Well, see, that was quite the breakneck look from Victorian architecture up through Carl Koch. So I don't know if that spurs any ideas about how architecture changed from one point to the other, from that Victorian masonry building that we saw up through the Fitchburg Library and through the Fitchburg Paper Company.
Well, I think that the way technology has really driven architecture from its inception, we were always trying to create shelter, and we're always trying to create better shelter for our living quarters, for where we do things, where we meet as groups or religiously, and we're always trying to find a better material, lasts longer, does the job better. So it's kind of depending on where, in some ways, where science and what's available to us where we live, it's going to make it happen. So it's in the 19th century, when the first Wallace Library was built, it was timber construction on the inside, masonry construction on the outside, a little bit of use of maybe some iron and some cast iron inside. If you look inside the Historical Society, your main meeting room in there, as you come in, what used to be part of the original storefront there, I believe there's cast iron columns, and there's a wooden ceiling, but there are some early steel beams and reinforced wood with steel in those buildings. So that was, what year was that building?
Yeah, you're right. That's the early 1890s, and it looks like a very traditional building. You know, when I first went in, I thought it was quite a traditional masonry, and then I noticed that it has the very thin steel columns holding it up, and they're decorated like fluted columns. So there's this reference to old-fashioned, to an earlier era of architecture, but it makes that great big open space possible.
And that was the same architect that designed the Wallace Library, the original Wallace Library.
That's
also.
right.
So.
maybe we could see that first picture of Wallace Library. So that architect would be Henry M. Francis, H.M. Francis, and he's actually from Fitchburg and really shaped what this city looked like in the 1800s and early 1900s. So what are we, so let's see what we're seeing with H.M. Francis. Well, if we could go back, there we go. So you're saying that this has some steel on the inside, but it's masonry mostly.
Very similar. It was probably within, I don't have the dates in front of me, but probably within about 10 years of when the Phoenix building for the Historical Society is now was built. Similar technology. The exterior walls are solid masonry, mainly brick. That was fired clay. It's very permanent. It is very fireproof. It's strong in compression, and just like the Romans did, if we want to make a hole in a masonry wall, we use a rounded arch or even an arced arch, and we see that in many of our buildings. Even our old city hall that goes back another 40 years before this was built, probably. Has the arches in the front, and we can see those, that by having a masonry arch you can make an opening and still have the weight of the masonry, the weight of the floors and the roof being still supported. The arch brings it around the outside and into the sideways masonry there. And sometimes we have a large stone lintel over the rectangular openings also to kind of support the weight. But that's what we had, even in the Greek temples.
That's
large
right.
columns and horizontal stone lintels at the top that helped support kind of the load of it. So needed a big stone on the top of it to be able to take those forces of the weight above it.
So it seems like with a building like this one, when you're looking at it, you can see that there's a lot of sort of weight in it, and it gives you a sense of it having strength. And when we go on to the more modern pieces, sometimes you don't see the weight as much, you see the more open space than you had in this building.
But with the older buildings, what everyone overlooks is the fact that the buildings are of a time and of a construction material and of a labor force. So the masonry buildings were built in a certain way because they knew how to stack bricks on top of each other. They had people who could do that job. They had the open air and the places to go fire the clay, which we don't do that anymore. Labor became very expensive.
Right.
And as modernization came, and I have this in front of us, this was much more of a machine-built building than what we were used to from the late 1800s, and like you spoke about the City Hall.
Those were really made with a lot of labor and what would be a lot of labor costs. And certainly when you get to the Simon Saw and Steel Company, so in the I had this before in my head, in the late 30s, because it was going to open right before the Second World War, and then it got pushed back. Is that right? Am I remembering correctly?
As I recall, the Simon Saw building on Intervale Avenue was the first windowless factory designed, we think, in the United States. And this was because kind of the opposite of needing light and with lots of windows, particularly before electric lights and so forth, that really only got started in the beginning of the 20th century. But by the 1930s,
that's right.
This was an engineered manufacturing plant versus Fitchburg is full of all of our old mills, our old brick mills that have brick walls and tall windows to let light in and they weren't really deep because we needed light coming in from both sides so that the workers could be very productive. And by the 1930s, these older factories were very hot, very full of fumes, lighting conditions were not well, and the theory of design was evolving during this period of time where the designers of this building said, we can ventilate, we can make the steel and saw and knife manufacturing We can have it super well ventilated. They had underground ventilation and overhead. Being able to make the workers would be guaranteed to be almost in a conditioned space, if you will, because modern machinery, they had very large fans that kept the ventilation happening, and all the hot work of working with steel was made so that the workers were much more comfortable temperature-wise, and they could have controlled electrical lighting kind of all the time. So this kind of went in kind of reverse. Let's put no windows in it. We can control the environment completely. And we have the building still standing today, is our Simon Saw building, and it's a huge, big building with very few openings in it. Doors, only a couple windows in the building still. So it was a different change in technology, and this was in the 1930s. We can see kind of the Art Deco style that kind of shows, the streamlined railroad engines and things with this, the large horizontal lines and streaking on it. You kind of see. So decoration and also really a machine for manufacturing, if you will.
I think that the decoration helps them tell the story to the people looking at it. This is a very modern building. It's got these Art Deco designs on it. And it's funny, it's extreme modernism is why I second guessed myself about the date, because I thought it can't be as early as 29 and 30, but it really was. This is even earlier. This is not something we'll find in Fitchburg, but Peter Barron's factory from Germany, but it just gives you a sense of sort of the stripped down nature of the factories, that as they're getting developed in this sort of different ways, that you've got a modern stripped down aesthetic coming in. But as you mentioned, Keith, it still has a lot of big windows, in this case, trying to get that light into the factory, not deciding to use the electric light yet, but trying to have big factory windows. Sample of the sort of modernism that we have in Europe. So now here's very much the European design. We're racing forward, as you see. This is just an example that I found online of Walter Gropius, who was teaching at the Harvard School of Design, where Carl Koch studied, and so this would be sort of an example of the Bauhaus aesthetic that Carl Koch had. Again, a picture from the students, where the students were at Harvard with the design. So also, this was from Sweden, where Carl Koch went to study. Or went after he finished his studies. He did a year working in Sweden. And I have to say that when I first came to Fitchburg, I kept thinking that Carl Koch was from Europe, because of the way he was influenced by this sort of the European style of this time. But actually he was from Milwaukee, and then came out here to New England, stayed in New England after he went to graduate school at Harvard. And I've got a later building from Europe also, but I was so struck by how, this one's also in Sweden, and how many shared design elements there are with what Carl Koch was doing, sort of the open spaces, the skylights, and these, in this case, these columns with sort of
the material use in the Scandinavian as well, with the fresh woods and the stark plaster. It's pretty typical in the mid-century modern architecture.
That's a great point. Yeah, I really could, you see that language. It's something that we recognize from here in Fitchburg. And did we have any other pictures? Okay, so we'll go. So, and then, so when Carl Koch came here to Fitchburg, do you want to talk more about the Bauhaus aesthetics, or what did he learn when he was in graduate school? Just some of the nuts and bolts of it.
Well, I have very limited experience with the gentleman. Short time here in Fitchburg, But with the Bauhaus, with the modern aesthetic that was happening over there at that time, where they were starting to express the structure of the building on the exterior, opening it up to light. And I mentioned this earlier. It's more of a, as you mentioned, it's a machine. The building is a machine, and they're expressing the bone and the sinew and the openness of it. And as technology grew and got better and better, they were able to go thinner and they were able to go taller and do more and more things. And that was part of the essence of the Bauhaus. It was an experiment.
Yeah.
And it operated up till like the mid-30s when politics forced it to shut down, and most of them moved on to other locations, the United States, and
that's
such,
how
and
these
on.
kind of buildings came to the United States
Right.
so much, yeah.
And that's how we were lucky to get these professionals and practitioners to bring this over here and keep it going.
Yeah, I think I was very surprised when I moved to this area to see how many modern buildings that you would stumble across that showed that influence of the sort of the Bauhaus aesthetic and the approach of modernism, combining the art and the design with these very, as you say, experimental building techniques.
Yeah, and it goes back to the form follows function. And a lot of people believe that, a lot of people don't, but it works out well in this, using these materials.
Yeah, we see.
And this methodology of building and designing.
Yeah. So we have a little bit of a film discussing one of those early buildings in Fitchburg, the Fitchburg Public Library, if we can show that.
The Fitchburg Children's Library was actually built behind the original Wallace Library that was a 19th century building, very symmetrical, kind of a Renaissance revival type of building with an art gallery up on the upper level, large flight of stairs to get up into the main floor of the library. And this was actually a donation from George Wallace's grandfather back in 1880s or 1890s, perhaps. As libraries and education kind of evolved during the 20th century, by the mid-20th century, but actually inviting younger children and so forth, and they would have good positive experiences with books and learning and resources of a library. So under the help of the Wallace family, the Fitchburg Public Library decided to add on a children's library. But with the old building there, they said, we need space that's very easy access for our children. So they made it a ground level opening, and they hired Carl Koch, who obviously the Wallace family knew. And Carl designed their children's library that was large, kind of open spaced. It had large skylights bringing in north light, and you can still see the skylights coming up off of the children's library wing now. That north light being not strong sunlight, but just good reading light, so there was always well lit inside. And all of these things in the beginnings of modern architecture as we know it, is what was a trend that actually primarily was born in Europe and Germany. Obviously, they were going through the Industrial Revolution at the same time. And architects and designers and industrial designers were looking at ways to use kind of the latest technology to create our buildings. Being able to look at buildings and what they're made from, is being able to kind of place them in history. And obviously, this does not have Greek and Roman decoration on it that we find from a lot of our past, but it does have kind of a modern art type of feeling to it that was certainly present in the day, and kind of using new materials in a way of kind of reflecting a progressive, a kind of a modern sense of life. And obviously including the outside reading area, courtyard, and the kind of the young adult area that was close to that, older children, and an auditorium for, I think it sat over maybe 200 some people, that was built at the same time. An auditorium, the children's wing, and this kind of reading outdoor garden space, primarily oriented toward for the children. What I remember, that particularly the landscaping of the garden space is very humane and sometimes whimsical, with fountains and various materials, a fireplace to kind of sit around. I don't know if there are many fires, but as you look at the detailing there, it has a lot of warm materials, warm flagstone floors. The fireplace has brightly colored curved tiles around it. And these kind of reflect, I believe, from probably the Scandinavian influence that Carl Koch received while he was working in Sweden for that year or so, and perhaps probably his other travels in Europe also, in that it had not quite as stark, but particularly for a children's setting, there were a lot of interesting kind of fun things happening, particularly in the outside landscaping. Just like the paper company, the building is fairly geometrical, but the landscaping is very freeform and complementary to the contemporary architecture design. So obviously Koch was rehired again in about how many years later, about 10 years or so later, to actually replace the Wallace family. Again, funded the main library reconstruction. In a quote from Wallace, he said, I'm actually tearing down my great-grandfather's original library for Fitchburg and replacing it with a new version that kind of meets the needs of what libraries are doing and the function that libraries had in the kind of the mid-20th century. So again, he used kind of technology, again, a little bit later than the design of his Fitchburg paper headquarters, but again using concrete as the main structural floor and roof systems, and you can kind of really see the technology that he used. This was cast in place concrete for the Fitchburg Library, and to get the forms and shapes that he was looking for to create the interior spaces, used kind of a unique and we don't see very often a poured concrete, kind of a mushroom, almost an upside down square umbrella shape. So as you go into the library, or even looking from the outside, you can see the concrete, poured in place concrete columns, and the kind of square-topped mushroom at the top.
Alrighty, well, I think that really says a lot about that building. I will mention that those stunning photographs, the black and white photographs, really give you a sense of what the experience of the building was when it was first built. Those are by Ezra Stoller, and those are in the collection of the Fitchburg Public Library that were very graciously allowed me to photograph those, that really give you a sense of the light in the space and how people interact in the space. You can see that it was a little more open than what we know now. Now it's a little more filled up with things, but you still see some of the drama of the architecture if you look at it today. And I thought, Russ, there were a lot of images, a lot of places where you could see how the outside was brought inside, the relationship that you'd talked about between the outside and inside.
And you can see in this image how they frame it against the street. They know it's going to be a problem street, and they do want to bring the outside in. So they raise the high wall up, and then you've got a clear story window above to get the light that they're trying to get. And then you've also got the north-facing skylights you saw from the inside for that nice artist light. so in the black and white photos, it was interesting because you did see what the plan was and you did see what the vision was. And then as you go away from the vision and more people come in, and you can see things get added and you start to lose the vision. And now the building isn't what it can be. But with the libraries now getting less and less in the collections, now you can go back to that more sparsely populated space. And if this building is here in 20 years, maybe we'll see that again, maybe not. But it's the interesting part of the lifespan of a building, that, you know. And I think we talked earlier about these infill brick panels on the two-story. Weren't those originally clear story? Weren't those originally glazing?
I think they were always there.
Oh, they were
This
there?
part was, but it's the outside facing it. We'll see that a little bit
It's
later.
in the children's
It's just
wing.
on the
In the
children's
children's
side, yeah,
library,
which is,
yeah.
I didn't
So we
realize
get-
right
there
here.
they are.
They're there, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's now all brick, and you can tell the difference. It went from a nice, playful, colorful experience for the kids going in to their own door to more of a, you know, lack of better terms, a public school entry.
Yeah, yeah. You could see that this certainly would have
Trying to be
had
nice.
the. So they wouldn't be too startling that you were going indoors. That it's got a little bit of the
Transition.
outdoors inside of it, and
Right.
and like some of his other buildings that we see, it's got the two interior spaces, or I should say two. What would you call this? The central areas where you have a garden and where you have the outdoor reading area for the kids, so that it's always got this sort of access to the outside light. We can see even in the newer building that the clerestory is there, letting in lots and lots of natural light to emphasize the sort of lightness of the height of the ceiling and how thin the columns are here.
And you know, the garden can't be ignored, because that was a huge design part of the building. So you've got your architect who has hopefully has the vision, and they pull in people, your landscape designers, your interior designers, and pull the whole thing off. So it takes a team of talented people to put the image together on paper and put it into brick and steel or whatever material.
Yeah. Yeah, we actually shared the names of all the different Fitchburg companies that were involved with building this building and providing the decoration and all the fittings and the furniture and everything. And it really was manufactured very much in Fitchburg. And in fact, I even found a reference to a curtain that I haven't seen yet, but it was designed by Thomas Wong, who was an artist from Fitchburg who was at Mass Art at the time as a student, and they had him designing a modernist curtain that's in there, and or that was in the children's room.
Right.
And I'm hoping that someday we'll find either the curtain or that design.
Yes.
And so let's see, we've got another little film looking now at the Fitchburg Paper Company office headquarters. And if we can take a look at that too.
This is the executive office building for Fitchburg Paper that was completed in 1959, I believe, or at least that's the date of this design. And this is a model that the architects prepared probably to show their clients, Fitchburg Paper and Mr. Wallace and his company, as kind of partway through their design process, to show the owner what an architectural model of what their conception of what the design was going to be like. So with an architectural model, they were able to show the contours of the property. This is, I believe, River Street running down along this side here. North is up in this direction, and the hillside travels up above in that direction. The kind of main traffic circle for the main entrance to the executive offices is at the top here, and it bridges over as the land falls off into actually the second level of the new proposed headquarters at this level here. As you can see behind, it is kind of a rectangular donut shape in its plan, with the various offices on the upper level going around with an interior courtyard, letting light and perhaps some ventilation into the interior. And the lower level that's just a little bit up above where River Street takes kind of its bend under the railroad bridge in this direction. So this is the architect's rendition of the project before it was actually built, and it was used to kind of convey in 3 dimensions exactly what the architectural design was going to look like. A nice thing about an architectural model is that it's something that's 3-dimensional instead of just having drawings, and the client can see kind of all of the various aspects of the building. This is the facade that we usually see as we're driving by on River Street, kind of the side that starts getting back up into the hillside that we normally don't have access to. There is a small parking area over on this east side of the building. And as we kind of rotate around to the upper side or the back side, we can see the hillside is coming down, and so it's a 2-story kind of stepped in, a double level, entering main entrance on the upper level and obviously an entrance on the lower level also. There is a stream that actually comes down through the property, and that was incorporated in the extensive landscaping that was done for this property, and still an amazing, beautiful landscape property. And we can still see the pond, which is actually fed by a stream that comes from way up the hill, and there are a series of waterfalls that have been enhanced through the landscape design, so they have some nice bubbling water coming down through the property, and another pond here. I'm not sure where the outlet goes, but it all eventually gets down to the Nashua River. It's not too far away from here. This was the concept, and we can see from news releases and other pieces that there was actually incorporated a heliport on top of the building. I believe it might have been in this back section over here, where people could fly into the Fitchburg paper headquarters with their helicopter. And we can see in today's building, there's actually an access bridge that's been added up to this upper parking level that probably accessed, obviously, to the roof level, but anybody coming in by helicopter could then come down and get into the main building. I think there's additional entrances on this side. So it's quite an interesting layout. It was designed to have lots of light coming into it, and in some ways this was designed in the 1950s and executed probably very shortly thereafter. And the architects were concerned about shading and daylighting coming into the building, and we can see there's overhangs built into the building that provided some shade. And we can see there's overhangs built into the building that provided some shade, certainly for the western sun coming in here, and kind of smaller windows on this western side where we get that, particularly in the summertime, that overheating low west sunshine coming in. On the southern side, again, we have overhang on this side where the 2 stories are actually set back from this facade. And this is something we see in this model and some other of Koch's buildings, such as the Fitchburg Public Library, that has very similar types of overhangs, that the walls are actually set back from the actual roof section. This is definitely designed to meet the topography, and certainly parts of Fitchburg certainly have challenging topography to them. And this hillside, like many places in Fitchburg, has a steep slope going up with it. And this section was kind of, almost appears like it was kind of partially carved out of this area to allow the kind of 2 stories of the administrative offices for it. They're paper plants that were basically across the street, and all up and down the river, as were other manufacturing and paper businesses here in Fitchburg. So again, this was designed in the 1950s, and as we look at kind of the evolution of architecture, and certainly the way architecture is done is quite often governed by the current technology of the day, what the building materials were, how could we make longer and longer spans without having columns within structures, column-free areas. In this case, lots of light into the buildings with more windows and openings, and kind of using kind of the latest technologies. As technology advanced during the early 20th century, structural steel became more and more. We had cast iron, we had some cast iron bridges and things like that were certainly from kind of the Civil War period onward. The railroads were using lots of steel for rails and their cars and engines. It's kind of mid-19th century forward. But we're starting to use more and more steel in the production of actually having structural steel to create longer spans that started replacing a lot of the wood framing that we have in our Fitchburg buildings. And that certainly started to change the way architecture and buildings could be built, that we could be using structural steel to support the floors, to support the roofs, and by having columns, even on the exterior of our building, we could put up large steel frame buildings, and actually the outside walls were not supporting the buildings anymore, like our brick masonry buildings with windows are kind of punched out with the arched opening that distributes the loads. Now we could have structural frame type of systems, and the outside wall became kind of something we could do kind of anything we wanted with. We could put lots of glass in it, and we see a lot of our early 19th century or 20th century factory buildings that had lots and lots of panes of glass. Sometimes only pieces of glass are maybe 12 inches by 18 inches in size. That was the size of glass we could typically make fairly inexpensively and set in metal frames. And electrical lighting was still very kind of new, even in the early part of the 20th century. So we still depended, a lot of our workspaces have natural light on the inside of it. So we could use concrete with steel, mass-produced steel reinforcing, and be able to start to make concrete reinforced buildings. Kind of after World War II and through the 1950s, just before this is happening, we started, engineers started saying we can make concrete in factories and we can preform it, we can make it into structural shapes in a factory under very controlled conditions. The concrete mixer is right there in the factory, the temperature is right there, it's undercover, it's not raining on the concrete. So we're prefabricating or making precast, meaning it's not cast on the building itself, it's cast in a concrete factory. So making precast concrete was really developed about the mid-century, kind of right before this is happening, these designs. Building technology evolved, making higher quality concrete, much stronger than we can do in the factory. And being able to, or in the factory is much stronger because we can control the temperature, the humidity, the concrete will cure at a much stronger, and it's just a higher quality because it's under protected conditions. And we see bridges, big long spans over there, our highways that are made with reinforced precast concrete. It comes in with usually quite often like a T-section where the roadway would be on the flat part and it has a bottom part and like the letter T. And this bottom part is where a lot of the structural steel is in the bottom of it, because as we put load on the T, it's going to bend like this, and the bottom of it is getting into tension, and that's where we put most of the reinforcing steel. So as we look at above each one of these columns in front is a structural T. I'm just going to tilt this up a little bit. And I'm not sure
Focus in on it more.
if you can see those. Am I up too high?
Nope, that's okay. I've got it. There we oh, that's a great shot. Let me see if I can even get closer. Okay.
So on each floor, but particularly at the roof level, we can see there's the wide T. It's maybe 5 or 6 feet wide on the top, and it starts halfway between each column and comes into the bottom portion of it is this little section right here, and then it sets on the post. And you can kind of see the depth of that, or maybe over in here. You can start seeing these are called structural Ts, or they are made with precast concrete. And this is evolution that's happening mid-20th century. And this is, I think, the Wallace family and Fitchburg paper were certainly into using the latest technology for their manufacturing to be able to produce better paper and less cost. And the same way they were looking at their building as using the latest technology. So Carl Koch was saying we can get long spans. We can span from here all the way into the inside courtyard area with a single span, no columns in the middle of this, by using these precast structural concrete Ts, if you will, to do it.
We feel that we have one of the finest buildings of its kind in the New England area. See what a charming effect has been created through the use of multicolored, ribbed, porcelain enameled steel panels. These contrast with the stark white columns and the beams of pre-stressed, precast concrete. Yes. Yeah, those last words were from their dedication program for the building, and we were just noticing what a beautiful model that is, and that you're discussing there. That's part of the Fitchburg Historical Society's collection, and that it's got a little Rolls Royce on it. That would be George Wallace III's Rolls, and that it was also because George Wallace III loved to ride his helicopter all around Fitchburg that it ended up with a helicopter pad. So a building that also expressed a little bit about the person himself that was paying for the building. But that the model, you were saying it's a striking model.
Yeah, well, it communicates everything that the building is trying to be from the designer. The designer's interpretation of what the owner wanted to construct and have his memory and his I can't think of words today. Yeah. But and so the model stands the test of time to show us what it was and what they wanted, even if there's alterations or damage or destruction. We always have the models to go back to, and we don't do those anymore.
That's a great point. That when I ran across that model in our collection, I recognized then which building it was and decided I really want to take a second look at that building. It's much more striking than I had realized just driving past quickly on River Street, that it shows you the ideas. You mentioned too that how different it was from, so this is 30 years after the Simon's Windowless factory, and they're trying to do some new things here at this point.
Yeah, materials have changed, techniques have changed, fabrication has changed. So they've gone from a thick-walled structure with an interior steel frame to a more transparent structure, letting the outside in and the inside out again.
Maybe we can look at some of the pictures, and so we saw them on the model in the little film, and this is the entryway. I tried to take sort of a dramatic photo of the entry, so that you see just a sense of, even though it's a square building, it's a square building on a multi-level lot with a a lot of interesting on the exterior and quite dramatic looking. Well, here we can see what you were discussing, I think the lightness.
And the entrance on the second level is interesting. You know, hierarchically, the boss is up high, so he drives up with his car and goes over his bridge to his office, and all his people are below him.
So it looks like those are the T-beams that you were talking about on the film, Keith?
Correct. Those are the precast structural T's, and they're on very slender columns, and you can see the first floor. You can see the structural T's that actually have the vertical section of the T extends out and actually picks up the column for the roof column. I think they're supported down below there. So there's the architect did some design, had the T's. Obviously, they're made in the factory, but they're made to specification for each particular project. This case, the building, quite often we see them in bridges and things like that also. These are actually double T's, I believe, where it is actually like two T's that are made together, and they're wide enough so that you could actually put them on a truck, and they could still fit on a truck and get on the highway as a special wide load probably. So they weren't single T's, these were actually double T's,
So
I believe.
you mean like the arch part was complete and it's two of those?
And there was a half an arch on the other side that would meet the other T, the other double T on the other side.
You see where they join at the narrow piece.
That narrow place, it goes up towards it a little bit, and
Yeah.
there's a little bit of a join
So
there.
that's the T right there.
I see. And that makes it possible for it to have all those windows there. Then that was.
And I think even that access way going up to the roof, so you could get off the helicopter and get down to the office.
Yeah.
Those were actually little mini structural concrete T's also, if I recall.
Really?
It stopped there a little while ago. And the front entry, that big walkway, is one double T going in that is the roof.
I think we definitely noticed. Yeah, I didn't get it in this picture, but you and I, we noticed that in the model and in some other views. Oh, well, there it is.
That's
That's a good image.
Yeah.
That's the entryway. That's right, and there you can see those.
Yeah.
The shape of
So,
it.
Fabrication, and it was very popular during the 50s and 60s as building materials. As we get later on into the 70s and 80s, and particularly into the 21st century, we started to become much more conscious, or designers and building codes became much more conscious of energy and energy consumptions of buildings. And these buildings, the 50s and 60s, we really didn't care how much oil they burned to heat and how much electricity we used to air condition the buildings. And the single pane glass and the concrete that was not insulated at all was just like having a radiator to the outside. So it wasn't a concern. And this is some of the reasons we don't see buildings quite like this today. Technology has changed. So as we look at buildings, we can kind of start to see the time frame and start to understand what was happening in technology back in the 50s and in the 60s, or the 1930s, or even the 1880s and 90s of what we had, what was our tradition, what was our culture, and what was technology. Where could we get the materials we needed? The early European settlers to this country, they came to New England. They had trees, they made log cabins and wooden types of buildings. The people settling the West Coast, maybe not as much trees, or particularly the arid areas, they're using adobe, they're using other materials that are kind of the local material. So our architecture on the East Coast is a lot different than what you see on the West Coast. There's different cultural traditions. There's different technologies and materials available. And as we are able to ship things kind of all over the world now, things are melding together, that we're having more kind of an universal design in some ways. But it's always important to be able to link things into our individual cultures. And I think that's, for all of us, in Fitchburg, as we drive up and down our local streets and Main Street and see the different buildings, we can really start to understand what the culture, what the technology was in the day that they were being built. So anytime that we look at buildings, I think it's really kind of fun to, the more a little bit more you know, the more each building has its own personality almost and culture to it.
That's a great point. I'm thinking of how the people that work in some of these buildings say, oh, they're cold, but that was because now we're trying to save some energy, and before they might have just been pumping out lots of heat. And but there's still, that's the experience of it, the story. And certainly with the Fitchburg Public Library, somebody reminded me just before the program that I had to make sure to talk about how the children of Fitchburg gathered pennies together to pay for a new library, and that, you know, they did all sorts of things to raise money one by one. The kids did it. And when Eleanor Roosevelt came to see the newly built library, she commented on how impressed she was that the children of Fitchburg, you know, a famously working class kind of town, had raised money for their own library. And that's a big part, I think, of the history of that building. And the fact that we built the first library just for children, too, that was specifically for children, it has always been a big point of pride for Fitchburg.
And I think that was one of the early children's libraries in the United States. Fitchburg was really at the forefront of lots of technology, of lots of new machine works, and we hope that we still are. And you know, it's a great community with a great history behind it, and we can see those pieces as we look at the architecture and the things that the city has given. To us.
And actually, I want to make an announcement to the people that are watching today, because part of this history of Fitchburg is that the City Hall restoration in Fitchburg of its 1850s City Hall is going to be receiving a preservation award. And actually the award is going to be given this Wednesday, and it'll be streamed online, so you can watch Fitchburg get that award for preservation. And I'll also mention that the Historical Society is putting together an online exhibition about Fitchburg's mid-century photography. That's a program that we're working on right now, so keep an eye out for that. It'll have some curating and photos by Ashley Green of Fitchburg, and also Professor Keisha Tracy, also of Fitchburg. So I want to thank you both for being here today, Russ Karlstad and Keith Cheneau. Thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with us. I also want to do some thanks to Mass Humanities for their Bridge Street sponsorship of this program. Also a thank you to Freedom's Way National Heritage Area, because they encouraged us to think of this program as one of Fitchburg's hidden treasures. So they've been helping us get the word out about the program through their Hidden Treasures program. And I also want to thank Melissa Goranson from our board, who is here to monitor all of the comments and questions as we have this program, and also Sharon Bernard and the Fitchburg Public Library, who allowed me in to take so many pictures and films in the library. And finally, a thanks to Fitchburg Access TV, to Nate Glennie, to Ann Bisbee, and all of their team here who are creating the show here today. And so if you'd like to contact us at the Fitchburg Historical Society for more information, please visit our website, or you can call us at 978-345-1157, or write us at welcome@fitchburghistoricalsociety.com. I'm Susan Navarro. Please join us for more of our I Remember When programming. This has been a special program on the mid-century modernist architecture of Fitchburg.